A billionaire made a bet and married a dark-skinned waitress from McDonald's, not even knowing what secret she was hiding. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Edward Miller was a man who seemingly had it all. At 36, he was the CEO of one of the most prominent tech companies in the world, a self-made billionaire whose name appeared regularly in business magazines and whose reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him. His days were filled with high-stakes meetings, luxury travel, and the constant adoration of those who sought his favor. From the outside, Edward's life looked like a perfect blend of power and success, but those closest to him, if such people existed, would have noticed the cracks beneath the surface. Despite his wealth and achievements, Edward felt a creeping emptiness gnawing at him, a void he couldn't quite identify. One Friday evening, Edward found himself in the company of his inner circle, a small group of wealthy friends who had known him since his early days. The group gathered not in a five-star restaurant or exclusive club, but in the unlikeliest of places, a McDonald's. For Edward and his friends, visiting a fast food chain was a novelty, a source of ironic amusement. They lounged in a corner booth, their expensive suits and designer watches starkly contrasting with the humble surroundings. Edward, Richard Davenport, one of his oldest friends, said with a smirk, "You've done it all, haven't you? Built an empire, charmed the world, and collected every toy money can buy. But there's one thing I doubt you could do." Edward leaned back, his expression betraying mild curiosity. "Oh? And what might that be?" Richard gestured around the restaurant, his eyes narrowing as he searched for something, or someone. His gaze finally settled on a young woman behind the counter. She was serving customers with practiced efficiency, her smile warm despite the clear weariness in her eyes. Her name tag read Gabriella. She was striking in her simplicity, with smooth dark skin and natural curls tied back into a loose ponytail. She moved with purpose, and there was a quiet dignity about her that made her stand out in the otherwise mundane setting. Richard chuckled. "I bet you couldn't marry someone like her." The others laughed, but Edward's expression hardened. "Someone like her?" he echoed, his tone cold and questioning. "You know exactly what I mean," Richard said, unbothered by Edward's reaction. "Someone outside your world. No supermodels, no heiresses, no polished professionals, just a regular, everyday woman. Gabriella here seems perfect for the challenge. I mean, look at her. Working 2 jobs, probably living paycheck to paycheck. She's the complete opposite of anyone you'd ever consider." Edward glanced toward the counter where Gabriella was taking an order, her expression calm and professional. For a moment, he found himself intrigued by her presence. She didn't fit the mold of anyone he'd ever paid attention to, but there was something about her demeanor that struck a chord. Perhaps her resilience or the quiet strength she seemed to carry. "And why exactly would I do this?" Edward asked, his tone skeptical but tinged with amusement. "Because you never back down from a challenge," Richard said, grinning. "Think of it as a test of your charm. Besides," he added with a smirk, "let's make it interesting. $2 million says you can't win her over and get her to marry you within 6 months." The table erupted in laughter again, but Edward's mind was already racing. $2 million was a trivial amount to him, but the challenge itself was another matter. He had always prided himself on his ability to succeed in any situation, no matter how unlikely or unconventional. And though he didn't admit it out loud, the monotony of his life had begun to weigh on him. Perhaps this was exactly the kind of distraction he needed. "You're on." Edward said, raising his drink in a mock toast. "But don't think for a second this will be difficult. I always win." Richard leaned back, clearly pleased with himself. "We'll see, my friend. Let the games begin." As the conversation shifted to other topics, Edward's gaze returned to Gabriella. She was now wiping down tables, her movements quick and methodical. He watched her for a moment longer than he intended, wondering what kind of life she led, what kind of woman worked in a place like this with such poise and grace. That night, as he returned to his sprawling mansion, Edward found himself thinking about Gabriella, not as a challenge, but as a person. Who was she? What did she dream about? What drove her to keep going in a world that likely offered her little in return? For the first time in years, Edward felt a flicker of genuine curiosity, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. But he quickly pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about understanding her, it was about proving a point. Edward Miller never lost, and this would be no exception. As far as he was concerned, Gabriella Hayes was just another prize to win, another accomplishment to add to his already impressive collection. And yet, deep down, something about this bet felt different. Edward didn't waste time. The next morning, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of the McDonald's where Gabriella worked. The hum of the engine of his sleek black sports car drew a few curious glances, but Edward paid them no mind. He wasn't here to make a spectacle. He had a mission to complete. Inside, the restaurant bustled with weekend activity. Families with children crowded the tables, and workers moved briskly behind the counter. Gabriella was there, wearing the same uniform as the previous evening. She greeted customers with a polite smile, her tone professional yet warm. Edward studied her from a distance, noticing how she treated each person with the same care, whether it was a hurried businessman ordering a coffee or a frazzled parent with an impatient child. Edward ordered a coffee, his gaze fixed on her as she worked. When it was finally his turn in line, she looked up, her smile automatic, but her eyes cautious as they met his. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but detached. "What can I get for you today?" "Just a coffee," Edward replied, his tone casual yet deliberate. He wasn't sure what he expected her to do, perhaps react to his tailored suit or the faint aura of authority he exuded. But Gabriella showed no sign of recognition or interest. To her, he was just another customer. She handed him his order quickly, her attention already shifting to the next person in line. Edward stepped aside, slightly irked by her indifference. It was an unusual experience for him. Most people tried to engage him, to make an impression. But Gabriella seemed immune to his presence, and, for reasons he couldn't explain, that only intrigued him further. Later that day, Edward returned, this time choosing a seat in the corner where he could observe without being conspicuous. Gabriella moved through the restaurant with an air of quiet confidence. She wasn't chatty, but she was efficient, handling each task with practiced ease. When she took a brief break, sitting at a small table near the kitchen, Edward seized the opportunity. "Excuse me," he said, approaching her table with a polite smile. She looked up, surprised but composed. "Can I help you?" "Actually, I was hoping to introduce myself. I'm Edward," he said, extending his hand. "I couldn't help but notice how hard you work. It's impressive." Gabriella hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand briefly. "Gabriella," she replied, her tone polite but wary, "and thank you, but I'm just doing my job." Edward sat down across from her without waiting for an invitation, his movements smooth and self-assured. "I imagine it's not easy." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" "Working here," he clarified, dealing with all kinds of people, long hours. I'm sure it's challenging." Gabriella's expression hardened slightly. "It's honest work. I don't see it as a challenge, just part of life." Edward noted the edge in her voice and realized he'd misstepped. "Of course," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I just admire your dedication." She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to figure him out. "Thanks, I guess. But why are you telling me this?" Edward paused, caught off guard by her directness. He was used to people accepting his compliments without question, but Gabriella wasn't like anyone he'd encountered before. She seemed unimpressed by his charm, and that only made him more determined. "I suppose I was curious," he admitted. "You seem like someone who has more to offer than this place might allow." Gabriella's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's kind of presumptuous, don't you think? You don't know me." Edward smiled faintly, sensing the challenge in her tone. "You're right, I don't. But maybe I'd like to." Before she could respond, a colleague called her name, signaling the end of her break. Gabriella stood, her expression neutral as she looked down at him. "Thanks for the chat, Edward, but I need to get back to work." As she walked away, Edward felt a flicker of frustration. She wasn't like the women he usually interacted with, who eagerly sought his attention and approval. Gabriella seemed uninterested in playing along, and that only deepened his curiosity. Over the next few days, Edward made frequent visits to the McDonald's, each time engaging Gabriella in brief conversations. At first, she remained guarded, her answers short and to the point. But gradually, her demeanor softened. She started asking him questions, simple ones about his job and his background. Edward kept his answers vague, not wanting to reveal too much about his wealth or status. He wanted her to see him as just a man, not a billionaire. Through their conversations, Edward began to piece together more of Gabriella's story. She had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, raised by parents who had instilled in her a strong sense of responsibility and resilience. After their deaths, she had taken on the role of caretaker for her younger sister, sacrificing her own dreams to ensure her sibling had a chance at a better life. "I wanted to be a teacher," Gabriella admitted one afternoon as they sat together during her break, "but it didn't work out." "Why not?" Edward asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "A lot of reasons. Money, time, and let's just say the world isn't always kind to people like me." Edward frowned, sensing the weight of her words. "People like you?" Gabriella glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You know what I mean." He didn't press further, but her comment lingered in his mind. For the first time, he began to consider the barriers she had faced, the systemic challenges he had never had to think about. It was a perspective he hadn't encountered before, and it left him unsettled. As the days turned into weeks, Edward's interactions with Gabriella became a routine. He found himself looking forward to their conversations, drawn not just by the challenge of winning her over, but by a genuine fascination with her character. Gabriella, in turn, started to let her guard down, though she remained cautious. There was something about Edward that intrigued her, but she couldn't quite figure out his intentions. Edward, however, knew exactly what he wanted. The bet had started as a game, but with each passing day, it felt less like a contest and more like an opportunity. Gabriella was unlike anyone he had ever met, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he wanted to know her better. He just wasn't sure how much of himself he was willing to reveal. Edward's visits to the McDonald's had become so frequent that the staff began to notice. The polished, suited man sitting in a corner booth or casually chatting with Gabriella during her break was an unusual sight. The other employees occasionally teased Gabriella, nudging her to ask what was going on, but she brushed them off with a faint smile or a quick change of subject. Still, she couldn't deny the growing intrigue she felt toward Edward. Edward, for his part, was finding it harder to view his interactions with Gabriella as part of a mere game. He'd initially approached her with calculated charm, aiming to impress her with his wit and attentiveness. Yet, as their conversations deepened, he found himself genuinely interested in her thoughts, her perspective, and the strength she radiated despite the challenges she faced. One rainy afternoon, Edward decided to take things a step further. Instead of waiting for her break at McDonald's, he waited for Gabriella to finish her shift. As she stepped out into the drizzle, pulling her coat tightly around her, Edward approached with an umbrella. "Need a ride home?" he asked, smiling as he held the umbrella over both of them. Gabriella hesitated. "Why are you still here?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. Edward shrugged. "Thought you might appreciate not walking home in the rain." Gabriella sighed, glancing at the dark clouds overhead. "All right," she said, her voice reluctant, "but only if you promise not to make this a habit." Edward chuckled. "No promises." In the car, the conversation turned personal. Edward, steering with one hand, asked her about her dreams. Gabriella, caught off guard, hesitated before answering. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted, her voice soft. "I love working with kids, helping them find their potential, but life had other plans." "Other plans?" Edward prompted. Gabriella exhaled deeply, staring out the window. "When my parents died, my sister was still in high school. I couldn't afford to keep pursuing my degree and take care of her at the same time. So, I put my dreams on hold, got a job, paid the bills, and made sure she had what she needed." Her words struck a chord in Edward. He thought about his own life, the privileges he'd taken for granted, the doors that had always been open to him. Gabriella's sacrifices were a stark contrast to his own relentless pursuit of success, a pursuit that had often come at the expense of others. "What about now?" he asked after a pause. "Is it still on hold, or have you let it go?" Gabriella smiled faintly. "It's complicated. I'd love to go back to school someday, but between work and everything else, it feels unrealistic." Edward wanted to say something, to offer help, but he stopped himself. He knew that offering her money or resources outright would only make her wary. Gabriella was proud, and he didn't want to undermine that. Instead, he said, "You'd make a great teacher, I can tell." Gabriella glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Thanks," she said quietly, as he dropped her off at her apartment. Gabriella lingered by the car door for a moment, looking at him thoughtfully. "You're different," she said almost to herself. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "I don't know," she replied. "You don't fit into any box I can think of, but that makes me wonder what you're really after." Edward met her gaze, feeling a twinge of guilt. He wanted to tell her the truth, that this had started as a bet, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. "I guess you'll have to keep wondering," he said lightly. Gabriella rolled her eyes but smiled faintly as she stepped back. "Good night, Edward." "Good night, Gabriella." As Edward drove away, he found himself replaying the conversation in his mind. Gabriella's story had affected him more than he expected. She wasn't just someone he was trying to win over for the sake of a challenge. She was someone who deserved more than the hand life had dealt her. In the following weeks, Edward continued to spend time with Gabriella, finding ways to integrate himself into her routine. He began showing up at the community center where she volunteered, helping with events and even donating supplies under the guise of wanting to support her work. At first, Gabriella was skeptical of his motives, but his consistent presence began to wear down her defenses. One Saturday, during a fundraiser at the community center, Gabriella found herself watching Edward as he helped set up tables and chairs. He looked out of place in his crisp shirt and expensive shoes, but he worked without complaint, chatting easily with the other volunteers. "You're surprisingly useful," Gabriella teased as they worked side by side. Edward grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is," she admitted. "I didn't expect someone like you to care about this kind of thing." "Someone like me?" Edward echoed, curious. "You know what I mean," Gabriella said, her tone light but pointed. "You're used to boardrooms and luxury cars, not folding chairs and bake sales." "Maybe," Edward said thoughtfully, "but it's nice to do something that actually feels meaningful." Gabriella glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "That's not what I expected you to say." Edward shrugged, looking slightly self-conscious. "Maybe you don't know me as well as you think." Gabriella didn't respond, but something about the moment stayed with her. Despite their growing closeness, Gabriella remained cautious. She couldn't shake the feeling that Edward's interest in her was too good to be true. Why would a man like him, a wealthy, successful CEO, spend so much time and energy on someone like her? The disparity between their worlds felt insurmountable, and the thought of getting too close to him terrified her. Edward, meanwhile, found himself grappling with his own doubts. His feelings for Gabriella had shifted, becoming something far deeper than he anticipated, but the shadow of the bet loomed over him, a constant reminder that their connection had started under false pretenses. He knew he needed to tell her the truth, but the fear of losing her kept him silent. For now, they existed in a fragile balance, both drawn to each other yet held back by their own uncertainties. Neither of them could predict how long that balance would last, or what would happen when it inevitably tipped. Edward had been rehearsing the moment in his head for weeks. Every time he thought about proposing to Gabriella, his mind veered into over-analysis. Should it be grand? Should it be subtle? Would she even accept? None of the scenarios he imagined seemed to do justice to what he felt, and though he'd initially approached her as part of a bet, his feelings had long since outgrown that shallow motivation. He didn't just want to win anymore. He wanted Gabriella in his life for real. On a crisp autumn evening, Edward invited Gabriella to dinner. This wasn't one of the fancy, high-profile restaurants she might have expected from a man of his stature. Instead, he chose a quiet little Italian place tucked away on a side street, the kind of place that felt personal, intimate, and unpretentious. Gabriella hesitated when he suggested it, but she ultimately agreed, intrigued by his choice. The restaurant had warm lighting, rustic decor, and a subtle charm that made Gabriella feel surprisingly at ease. They were seated in a cozy corner by the window, the soft hum of conversation around them creating an inviting atmosphere. "You've been quiet lately," Gabriella said, breaking the silence as she sipped her glass of wine. "Everything okay?" Edward smiled faintly, swirling the liquid in his own glass. "Just a lot on my mind." Gabriella studied him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Work stress?" "Something like that," Edward said, his tone evasive. Gabriella tilted her head, clearly unconvinced. "You've been different lately," she said. "Quieter, more thoughtful. It's not like you." Edward hesitated, caught off guard by her observation. She always had a way of cutting through the surface, of seeing the parts of him he tried to keep hidden. "I guess I've just been thinking about what's next," he said finally. "About what really matters." Gabriella raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "And what's that?" Edward took a deep breath. The moment he'd been planning had arrived, and yet his carefully rehearsed words felt inadequate. But he knew that if he didn't speak now, he might never find the courage to say what needed to be said. "You," he said simply, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "You matter, Gabriella, more than I ever expected." Gabriella's eyes widened slightly, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Edward wasn't finished. "When I met you, I thought I had everything figured out. My life was built on control, on power, on success. But then you came along, and suddenly none of that seemed important anymore. You showed me what it means to care about something real, to fight for something that matters, and I don't want to lose that." Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Gabriella's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a delicate diamond ring, not overly flashy, but elegant in its simplicity. "I know this might seem sudden," Edward continued, his tone earnest, "and I know we come from different worlds, but I've never been more certain about anything in my life. Gabriella, will you marry me?" The restaurant seemed to fall silent around them, or perhaps it was just Gabriella's mind, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. She stared at Edward, her heart pounding in her chest. For a few agonizing seconds, she said nothing, and Edward felt his pulse quicken with every beat. "Edward," Gabriella finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Edward said, his lips curving into a hopeful smile. "Say you'll let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that this isn't just a fleeting thing, that I'm serious about us." Gabriella took a shaky breath, her emotions a whirlwind of disbelief, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. She had been cautious about letting Edward into her life, unsure if she could trust him or his intentions, and yet, in this moment, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. Sincerity. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I mean, this is huge and complicated. We're so different, Edward. Your life, your world, it's nothing like mine." "I know," Edward said, his voice soft but determined. "And I don't care. I don't care about the differences or the challenges. All I care about is you." Gabriella's gaze dropped to the ring, her mind racing. She thought about her sister, about the life she had worked so hard to build despite the odds stacked against her. Was she ready to step into a world so far removed from her own? To trust someone like Edward with her heart? "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "What if this doesn't work? What if we're too different?" Edward reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Then we'll figure it out together, one step at a time. I'm not asking for perfection, Gabriella. I'm just asking for a chance." Gabriella looked at him, her chest tightening as she saw the genuine emotion in his eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility that this could be real, that Edward truly meant what he was saying. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I'll marry you." Edward's face lit up with relief and joy, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He slipped the ring onto her finger, the small diamond catching the warm light of the restaurant. "You won't regret this," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Gabriella managed a small smile, though her heart still pounded in her chest. "I hope not," she said, "because I don't think I can survive another heartbreak." "You won't," Edward promised. "I'll make sure of it." As the evening wore on, the initial tension began to ease, and their conversation flowed more naturally. Gabriella found herself laughing at Edward's dry humor, and for a moment the differences between their worlds seemed to fade into the background. But deep down, both of them knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be far from easy, and the challenges they would face together were only just beginning. For now, though, they allowed themselves this brief moment of happiness, both clinging to the fragile hope that love could bridge even the widest of divides. For weeks after their engagement, Gabriella and Edward found themselves in a strange yet comforting rhythm. Gabriella, ever practical, insisted on maintaining parts of her routine, despite Edward's assurances that she could take time to focus on their future together. She continued working at McDonald's, though she reduced her hours, splitting her time between that job and volunteering at the community center. Meanwhile, Edward threw himself into supporting her dreams, offering resources to help her launch the educational program she had always envisioned. The first signs of real progress came when Edward arranged a meeting between Gabriella and a group of investors he trusted. At first, she resisted the idea, unsure about stepping into his world, but Edward reassured her that the people he'd chosen were genuinely interested in her vision. With his encouragement, she presented her plan for a community-based learning center aimed at underserved children. Her passion and meticulous preparation impressed the investors, and they agreed to fund the project. Gabriella's confidence began to grow as the project gained momentum. She and Edward worked side by side, transforming an abandoned building into a bright, welcoming space filled with classrooms, reading nooks, and open areas for creative activities. Gabriella often marveled at how quickly things were coming together, but she couldn't shake a nagging feeling of doubt. It wasn't that she didn't trust Edward, at least not entirely, but their worlds still felt so far apart. The lingering question of whether their relationship could survive the weight of those differences haunted her. One evening, Edward invited Gabriella to a charity gala, a high-profile event filled with some of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the city. Gabriella reluctantly agreed, though she felt out of place from the moment she stepped into the grand ballroom. The glittering chandeliers, the flowing gowns, the clinking of champagne glasses. It was all so far removed from the life she knew. Edward stayed close to her, sensing her discomfort and doing his best to make her feel included. He introduced her to several of his acquaintances, all of whom were polite, though some barely hid their surprise at her presence. Gabriella couldn't help but notice the way some of the women eyed her critically, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. As the night wore on, Gabriella excused herself to get some air. She stepped onto a balcony overlooking the city, her chest tightening as she tried to shake off the overwhelming sense of not belonging. "Feeling a bit out of your element," a voice said behind her. Gabriella turned to see a man she recognized from earlier in the evening, Richard Davenport, one of Edward's oldest friends. He was tall, with a slick smile and an air of arrogance that immediately put her on edge. "It's a little overwhelming," Gabriella admitted, though her tone was cautious. Richard stepped closer, his expression shifting to something that looked like amusement. "I'm sure it is. These events can be intimidating, especially for someone who's not exactly used to this kind of crowd." Gabriella's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. I'm managing." "Of course you are," Richard said smoothly. "But I have to admit, I'm curious. How did someone like you manage to catch Edward's attention? He's usually particular." Gabriella stiffened, her discomfort deepening. "Edward and I met by chance," she said evenly. "It just happened." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't know, do you?" "Don't know what?" Gabriella asked, her stomach twisting at his tone. Richard hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then, with a slight smirk, he said, "Let's just say your relationship started out as an experiment, a little challenge among friends. Didn't he tell you?" Gabriella felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you talking about?" Richard leaned casually against the balcony railing, his expression unbothered. "Oh, don't look so surprised. It was harmless, really. Edward bet that he could win over someone completely outside his world. And, well, here we are." Gabriella's heart pounded in her chest, the words sinking in like stones. She stared at Richard, trying to process what he was saying. "You're lying," she said, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "Am I?" Richard said, his smirk widening. "Ask him yourself." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Gabriella alone with the weight of his revelation. Her mind raced, replaying every interaction she'd had with Edward. Could it be true? Had their relationship really started as a bet? When Gabriella returned to the ballroom, Edward immediately noticed that something was wrong. She approached him with a steely expression, her eyes filled with hurt and anger. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. Edward nodded, his concern deepening. "Of course. Let's step outside." They found a quiet corner away from the crowd, and Gabriella turned to face him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Is what true?" Edward asked, genuinely confused. "Did you bet on me?" Gabriella's voice cracked, and the pain in her eyes was impossible to ignore. "Did you start this because of some stupid challenge?" Edward froze, his mind reeling. He hadn't expected this, at least not now, not like this. For a moment, he considered denying it, but the look on Gabriella's face told him that would only make things worse. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not what you think." Gabriella took a step back, her breath hitching. "Not what I think. You used me, Edward. You treated me like some game, some prize." "No," Edward said urgently. "That's not true. It started that way, but it changed. I changed. Gabriella, I swear." "Don't," she interrupted, shaking her head. "Don't try to justify it. You lied to me. All this time you let me believe this was real." "It is real," Edward insisted. "I know I messed up, but my feelings for you aren't a lie. I love you." Gabriella laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. "You don't even know what love is, Edward. Love isn't a game. It's not a bet, and it's definitely not this." She turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing alone in the corner of the ballroom, his heart sinking as he realized just how badly he'd hurt her. That night, Gabriella returned to her apartment, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She thought about the moments she'd shared with Edward, the promises he'd made, the support he'd offered. How much of it had been genuine, and how much of it had been calculated, part of some twisted game. As she sat on her couch, staring at the engagement ring on her finger, Gabriella felt the weight of betrayal settle over her. She had let herself believe in Edward, in their future together, and now she didn't know if she could ever trust him again. Meanwhile, Edward spent the night in his empty mansion, grappling with the consequences of his actions. He had known the truth would come out eventually, but he hadn't anticipated how devastating it would be. For the first time in his life, Edward Miller felt truly powerless, and he realized that if he wanted any chance of winning Gabriella back, he would have to prove himself in a way he never had before. Edward woke the next morning to a hollow silence that filled every corner of his sprawling mansion. The air felt heavier, and for the first time in years, the vastness of his home felt suffocating. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, tempted to call Gabriella to beg for another chance. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Words wouldn't fix what he had broken. She was right to leave. He had lied to her, manipulated her, and treated her feelings as if they were part of some business transaction. No grand gesture or carefully crafted apology could erase the pain he had caused. If he wanted her back, if he truly wanted to make things right, he had to become someone worthy of her trust. Gabriella, meanwhile, buried herself in work. The community center and her budding educational project became her refuge, the only things keeping her from falling apart. She avoided Edward's calls and ignored the texts that trickled in over the following days. Her heart ached with every message she read, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. How could she? The man she thought she loved had turned out to be a stranger, someone who had seen her as nothing more than a bet. Her sister, Brianna, noticed the change immediately. One evening, as they sat together in their modest apartment, Brianna finally spoke up. "You've been quiet," she said, her tone cautious. "Is everything okay?" Gabriella hesitated, then sighed. "No, everything's a mess." "Is it Edward?" Brianna asked. When Gabriella didn't respond, she pressed further. "Did he hurt you?" "Not in the way you think," Gabriella said, her voice strained. "He lied to me. About everything." Brianna frowned. "What do you mean?" Gabriella hesitated, then explained what she had learned about the bet. The words tasted bitter as she spoke, and by the time she finished, her chest felt tight with the weight of it all. "I trusted him, Bree," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought he saw me for who I was, not just some game." Brianna reached out, squeezing her sister's hand. "I'm so sorry, Gabby. But do you think he really cared about you? Or was it all just about the bet?" Gabriella stared at her hands, her thoughts swirling. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought he cared. But how can I believe anything he says now?" Edward, desperate to prove his sincerity, began making changes in his life. The first and most significant decision came during a meeting with his company's board of directors. Sitting at the head of the sleek, glass-walled conference room, Edward spoke with a calmness that belied the turmoil inside him. "I'm stepping down," he announced, his voice steady but firm. The room erupted into a cacophony of protests and confusion. The board members, many of whom had been with the company since its inception, looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "This company is your legacy," one of them argued. "You can't just walk away." "I can, and I will," Edward said, his tone brooking no argument. "My priorities have changed. I want to focus on something more meaningful." The decision sent shockwaves through his professional circle, but Edward didn't care. For years, he had measured his worth by the size of his fortune and the power he wielded, but none of that mattered anymore. If he wanted to rebuild his life and any hope of a future with Gabriella, he needed to let go of the person he used to be. With the proceeds from selling his stake in the company, Edward created a foundation dedicated to supporting underserved communities, with a special focus on education. Inspired by Gabriella's vision, he poured his resources into initiatives that aligned with her goals, though he made a point of keeping his involvement quiet. He didn't want her to think this was just another empty gesture. Gabriella first heard about the foundation through a mutual acquaintance at the community center. At first, she dismissed it as a coincidence. Edward had made grand promises before, and she wasn't ready to believe he was capable of genuine change. But as the weeks went by, she began to hear more about his work. Former employees from a closed factory in her hometown, one of Edward's past business ventures, were being offered job training and financial support through the foundation. Local schools were receiving grants for supplies and after-school programs. And most surprising of all, Edward himself was frequently seen at these events, not as a figurehead, but as an active participant. One afternoon, while overseeing renovations at the Learning Center, Gabriella received an unexpected visitor. Edward stood in the doorway, looking both nervous and determined. He held a small folder in his hands, and his usually confident demeanor was softened by the uncertainty in his eyes. "I know I'm the last person you want to see right now," he began, his voice quiet, "but I needed to talk to you." Gabriella crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "What do you want, Edward?" He stepped inside cautiously, handing her the folder. "I wanted you to see this. It's the work we've been doing through the foundation. I thought maybe it could help your project too." Gabriella hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside were detailed plans, budgets, and testimonials from people who had already benefited from the programs. She skimmed through the pages, her emotions a jumble of confusion, skepticism, and reluctant admiration. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Because I realized that everything I've done, everything I built, it doesn't mean anything if I can't use it to make a difference," Edward said. "And because you were right about me. I didn't know what love was, but I do now. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." Gabriella stared at him, her heart aching with the weight of his words. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself hope that he had truly changed. But another part of her, the part that still bore the scars of his betrayal, wasn't ready to let go of the pain. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said finally, her voice trembling. Edward nodded, his expression resigned but resolute. "I understand. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm trying to be better. For you. For us." With that, he turned and left, leaving Gabriella alone with the folder and her thoughts. Over the next few weeks, Gabriella watched from a distance as Edward continued his work. She saw the effort he was putting into the foundation, the genuine care he showed for the people he was helping. Slowly, her anger began to soften, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she couldn't deny that he was changing. One evening, as she walked through the now completed learning center, Gabriella allowed herself to imagine a future where Edward could be a part of her life again. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to spark a small, hesitant smile. Perhaps redemption was possible after all. Weeks had passed since Edward's visit to the learning center. Gabriella remained cautious, keeping her distance while observing his actions from afar. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but the sincerity of his efforts was becoming harder to ignore. The foundation he had established was flourishing, with visible impact on the communities it served. Schools in underserved areas were receiving resources they desperately needed. Vocational training programs were helping displaced workers, and Edward was often seen working directly with the people he aimed to help. For someone who had once epitomized corporate detachment, Edward's transformation was remarkable. Gabriella couldn't help but wonder, was this truly who he was now, or was it just another calculated move to win her back? One afternoon, as Gabriella walked through the bustling community center, she overheard a group of volunteers discussing Edward. Their words were filled with admiration, describing how he had spent hours personally helping to organize supplies for a local school. It was a far cry from the man she had first met, the man who had walked into her life with arrogance and ulterior motives. Still, doubt lingered. She wasn't ready to let her guard down. That evening, Gabriella sat at home with her sister Brianna. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the television in the background. Brianna, ever perceptive, broke the silence. "You're thinking about him again," she said, glancing at Gabriella with a knowing look. Gabriella sighed, sinking deeper into the couch. "I don't know what to think. He's doing all the right things, but how do I know it's not just another game?" Brianna leaned forward, her expression serious. "Gabby, I know you're scared, and I don't blame you, but you've seen the changes he's made. He didn't just throw money at the problem and walk away. He's putting in the work. That has to mean something." Gabriella shook her head, uncertainty clouding her thoughts. "It's just hard to believe. After everything—" Brianna placed a hand on her sister's shoulder, her voice gentle. "You don't have to decide anything right now, but don't close the door completely. People can change, Gabby. Maybe he really has." A week later, Edward reached out to Gabriella again, this time with a simple request. He wanted to meet, not to talk about their relationship or his attempts at redemption, but to discuss a new project he thought could help her learning center. After some hesitation, Gabriella agreed. They met at a modest cafe near the community center, a neutral ground that felt less intimidating than his usual world of luxury and opulence. Edward arrived early, his demeanor subdued but hopeful. When Gabriella walked in, he stood to greet her, his smile tentative. She returned the gesture with a polite nod, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming," Edward said as they sat down. "I wasn't sure if you would." Gabriella folded her hands on the table, her gaze steady. "I'm here for the project, Edward. That's all." He nodded, understanding the boundary she was setting. "Of course. I appreciate it." Edward pulled out a folder filled with documents and laid it on the table. "I've been working on an idea for a scholarship program," he began. "It would provide funding for students who want to pursue higher education but don't have the resources. I thought it could complement what you're doing at the Learning Center." Gabriella hesitated, then opened the folder. As she scanned the documents, she was struck by the thoroughness of his plan. It wasn't just a vague concept. Edward had clearly put significant time and effort into crafting a program that aligned with her vision. This is good," she admitted, her voice reluctant. "It's exactly what we need." Edward smiled faintly, relief washing over him. "I'm glad you think so. I want to fund the program entirely, but I'd like you to oversee it. You know better than anyone what these kids need." Gabriella looked up at him, her expression a mix of surprise and skepticism. "You'd put me in charge? Why?" "Because I trust you," Edward said simply, "and because this is your dream. I just want to help make it a reality." Gabriella studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. What she saw was a man who looked tired but determined, someone who had been humbled by his mistakes and was now trying to find a better path. "I'll think about it," she said finally, closing the folder. Edward nodded, his expression respectful. "That's all I ask." Over the following weeks, Gabriella and Edward began working together on the scholarship program. Their interactions were professional at first, marked by careful boundaries and unspoken tension. But as they spent more time together, Gabriella couldn't help but notice the subtle ways Edward had changed. He listened more, spoke less, and seemed genuinely invested in the success of the project. One afternoon, as they reviewed applications for the program, Edward paused, his gaze thoughtful. "Gabriella," he said quietly, "I know this doesn't make up for what I did, but working on this with you, it's the most meaningful thing I've ever done." Gabriella glanced at him, her expression softening despite herself. "It's a good start," she admitted. They fell into a companionable silence, the weight of their shared history lingering but not suffocating. For the first time in months, Gabriella allowed herself to believe that perhaps Edward's transformation was real. The turning point came during the launch event for the scholarship program. The Learning Center was filled with students, parents, and community members, all gathered to celebrate the initiative. Gabriella stood at the podium delivering a heartfelt speech about the importance of education and the power of opportunity. Edward watched from the sidelines, his chest swelling with pride as he saw her in her element. After the event, Gabriella found Edward standing near the door, speaking with a group of students. She approached cautiously, waiting until the others had dispersed before addressing him. "You did good today," she said, her tone softer than usual. Edward turned to her, his smile tentative. "It wasn't just me. This was your vision." Gabriella hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I still don't know if I can fully trust you," she admitted, "but I can see that you're trying. And I appreciate that." Edward nodded, his expression earnest. "I'll keep trying, for as long as it takes." Gabriella managed a small smile, her heart lifting ever so slightly. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the future of the scholarship program, but for the possibility of rebuilding what had been broken. Perhaps, she thought, second chances weren't entirely out of reach. The months that followed the launch of the scholarship program marked the beginning of a cautious but steady transformation in Gabriella and Edward's relationship. Their professional collaboration on the initiative gradually evolved into a personal connection once more, though Gabriella remained wary of letting her guard down completely. Edward, for his part, was patient. He didn't push for more than she was willing to give, focusing instead on proving his sincerity through actions, not words. The scholarship program quickly gained traction. It wasn't just the financial aid that made an impact, it was the mentorship and community support that Gabriella had worked so hard to incorporate. Students who had once felt overlooked now had access to resources and guidance that gave them a chance to dream bigger. Edward spent countless hours at the Learning Center, helping with everything from administrative tasks to organizing workshops. To the people around him, he was no longer a billionaire CEO, but a dedicated volunteer, a man trying to make a difference. Gabriella began to notice how the students gravitated toward Edward. He had a way of connecting with them that surprised even her. Whether he was sharing advice about perseverance or simply helping a struggling student with homework, Edward's presence felt genuine. Slowly but surely, Gabriella's skepticism began to erode. One evening, as they were closing up the Learning Center, Edward lingered by the door, watching Gabriella organize papers at her desk. The light from the desk lamp cast a warm glow around her, and for a moment, he simply stood there, marveling at how far they had come. "You're staring," Gabriella said without looking up, a small smile playing on her lips. Edward chuckled, stepping closer. "Can you blame me? You've created something incredible here." Gabriella glanced at him, her smile softening. "I couldn't have done it without your help." "Maybe," Edward said, "but this is your dream, Gabriella. I'm just lucky to be a part of it." Her expression grew thoughtful, and she set down the papers in her hands. "You've changed," she said quietly. "I don't think I realized just how much until recently." Edward leaned against the desk, his gaze steady. "You changed me," he admitted. "You made me see the world differently, and you made me want to be better." Gabriella looked at him for a long moment, her heart conflicted. She wanted to believe him, to trust that the man standing in front of her was truly different from the one who had broken her heart. But the scars of betrayal didn't fade easily. "I'm not saying I'm all the way there yet," she said finally, "but I think I'm ready to try." Edward's breath caught, his chest swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "That's all I could ever ask for." With each passing week, the walls between them continued to come down. Gabriella invited Edward to spend more time with her and her sister, Brianna, who quickly warmed to him. The three of them shared simple moments, cooking dinner together, playing board games, and laughing over shared memories. For the first time, Gabriella allowed herself to imagine a future where Edward wasn't just a part of her life, but a permanent fixture. Edward, meanwhile, found a new sense of fulfillment in his work at the Learning Center and the Foundation. The life he had once chased, one of wealth, power, and status, felt distant and unimportant. What mattered now were the connections he was building, the lives he was helping to improve, and the love he was slowly rebuilding with Gabriella. Several months later, on a cool spring evening, Edward invited Gabriella to dinner at the same quiet Italian restaurant where he had proposed months ago. The atmosphere was familiar, but this time there was no tension or uncertainty between them. They laughed easily, their conversation flowing naturally. As dessert was served, Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Gabriella froze, her heart racing as memories of their first proposal came flooding back. "Edward," she began, her voice trembling slightly. He held up a hand, his expression calm but filled with emotion. "I know what you're thinking, and I know I don't deserve a second chance at this, but I'm asking anyway." Edward opened the box, revealing a new ring, simpler than the first, but no less beautiful. "Gabriella, I love you, and this time I want to do it the right way. No lies, no games, just us building a life together. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Gabriella's eyes as she stared at the ring, her emotions a whirlwind. She thought about everything they had been through, the betrayal, the pain, the long road to rebuilding trust. But she also thought about the man Edward had become, the sincerity he had shown, and the love she still felt for him despite everything. "Yes," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'll marry you." Edward's face lit up with a mixture of joy and relief. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and this time it felt right. This time it felt real. Their wedding was a simple affair, held at the learning center that had brought them back together. Surrounded by friends, family, and the students whose lives they had touched, Gabriella and Edward exchanged vows that were filled with love, honesty, and hope for the future. In the months that followed, they continued to grow both as a couple and as partners in their work. The scholarship program expanded, reaching more students than Gabriella had ever dreamed possible. Edward's foundation became a beacon of support for underserved communities, a testament to how much he had changed. Then, one sunny afternoon, Gabriella came to Edward with unexpected news. She was pregnant. Edward was stunned, his emotions overwhelming him as he wrapped his arms around her. "We're going to be parents," he said, his voice filled with awe. Gabriella laughed, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, we are." As they stood together, holding each other close, Edward realized that everything he had once thought mattered. Money, power, prestige, paled in comparison to this. His life had been forever changed by Gabriella, and now, with their growing family, he felt complete. For Gabriella, the journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had found love, not in perfection, but in growth, forgiveness, and the willingness to fight for something real. Together, they had built a new life, one filled with purpose, joy, and the promise of a brighter future. And for the first time, they both knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more heartfelt narratives and inspiring journeys. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you're looking for more, check out our other stories. We can't wait to hear what you think.